She thought no one would question her authority. For years, Mrs. Clara Whitmore ruled her classroom with quiet cruelty, masking prejudice behind polished grammar and passive-aggressive smiles. But then came Aaliyah Monroe, a quiet black transfer student who refused to flinch. Mrs. Whitmore dismissed her, silenced her, humiliated her, all while thinking she held the final word. But when they picked Aaliyah Monroe, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was the daughter of the school's own principal, nor that she had the strength to endure, resist, and rise. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning, public and unforgettable. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one student. It's about all of us. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of room 22, casting soft shadows across a row of silent desks. At the front, a teacher gripped her marker. In the third row, a girl sat steady, waiting, not for permission to speak, but for the moment the truth would finally break through. The morning bell rang with its usual shrill finality, slicing through the chatter that lingered in the corridors of Brentwood High. Inside room 222, the air felt unusually tight, like something invisible had pressed in against the windows. At the front stood Mrs. Clara Whitmore, poised, polished, and perennially stern, scanning the students with the cold precision of someone who believed discipline was synonymous with distance. The door creaked open. In stepped a girl, dark-skinned, poised and silent. Her name was Aaliyah Monroe, and while she carried no air of arrogance, her presence was undeniable. A simple cardigan over a crisp uniform, hair neatly tied back, eyes observant, but calm. She wasn't trying to make a statement, but sometimes dignity speaks louder than defiance. Mrs. Whitmore's smile tightened, just slightly, but enough for those attuned to read the shift. "Well, well," she said, the saccharine tone barely veiling her scrutiny. "Let's hope you're not too far behind, Miss Monroe. We keep a rigorous pace in this classroom." The word rigorous hung in the air like a challenge. The other students turned, some curious, others smirking. Aaliyah said nothing. She simply found her seat in the third row and placed her notebook on the desk with quiet care. Not a word, not a reaction. But the tension in the room had already thickened, settling in the corners like dust no one dared disturb. Why is it that one new face can cause such unease? Not because of disruption, but because of what she represents. Mrs. Whitmore turned to the chalkboard, her back straight, but her eyes flicked often toward Aaliyah. The lesson began, but the energy was already off. Something was brewing beneath the surface, within the silence, behind the forced smiles. And sometimes, the most powerful storms begin with the quietest skies. By Thursday, Aaliyah had memorized the unspoken rules of room 202. She had learned which questions would earn smirks instead of answers, which desks creaked loudest, and, most painfully, which raised hands Mrs. Whitmore saw and which she chose not to. That morning the class began discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel rich with themes Aaliyah had studied deeply at her previous school. As Mrs. Whitmore opened the floor for analysis, Aaliyah raised her hand. Her movements were measured, her posture upright, her voice steady. "I believe the novel critiques systemic racism through—" "Systemic racism?" Mrs. Whitmore cut in, her tone laced with exaggerated amusement. "Miss Monroe, I think you're confusing literature with activism." The words landed like ice water. The room went still, then crackled with whispers and side glances. Some students shifted, uncomfortable, others smirked. Aaliyah blinked but didn't flinch. She sat back slowly, folding her hands over her notebook, though her knuckles whitened with pressure. Isn't education supposed to welcome new voices, especially the ones that challenge us to see differently? Mrs. Whitmore moved on without further acknowledgement, her chalk squealing on the board as if to drown out Aaliyah's presence. Every time Aaliyah raised her hand after that, the teacher's eyes would slide right past her. She was invisible, by design. And yet Aaliyah remained undeterred. Her pen still moved, her notes still filled the page, her mind still worked, Not because she was trying to prove something, but because she knew something no one else in that room did. She belonged, whether they liked it or not. In classrooms like this, silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it's the sharpening of a blade. Have you ever been ignored so thoroughly, so precisely, that it felt like erasure? Monday morning brought more than a chill in the air. It brought intent. Aaliyah stepped into the classroom with the same poise, the same silent grace. But Mrs. Whitmore was waiting. Her smile was sharper than usual, her stance tighter. The tension didn't creep this time. It arrived with boots on. "Aaliyah Monroe," she snapped before the girl could sit. "Is that gum I see in your mouth?" Aaliyah froze, startled. "No, ma'am," she replied quietly, confused. "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Whitmore barked, her voice slicing through the room like a lash. "Spit it out. Now." Aaliyah stood, walked slowly to the trash bin, and mimed discarding something that never existed. Not a word escaped her lips, but the message was loud. "You may embarrass me, but you won't break me." The class was dead silent. Some looked away. A few leaned in. Then came the correction. "Sit up straight. Fix your tone." "Rightator." "She righter?" he asked. "Don't slouch." Every remark was a dart, carefully aimed to pierce Aaliyah's calm. But she held the line. Her fingers gripped the pen tighter, her jaw set firmer. The defiance in her silence was no longer quiet. It was a roar muffled beneath breath. Have you ever watched someone get picked apart, piece by piece, while everyone else sat frozen? A few students began to shift. Sarah in the front row, who had always kept her head down, gave Aaliyah a glance. Not pitying, but pained. Others murmured behind cupped hands, unsure whether to laugh, defend, or look away. But Aaliyah didn't need their sympathy. What she needed was space. To breathe, to think, to endure, because something inside her had decided this isn't just survival, it's the beginning of a stand. Sometimes, injustice doesn't arrive in a single blow. It chips away, testing to see when you'll crack. The day of the group presentations arrived like a storm, hanging low in the sky, charged, silent, and waiting to break. Aaliyah stood at the front of room 202, a poster board behind her displaying crisp notes and carefully chosen quotes from To Kill a Mockingbird. Her voice was steady, her shoulders firm, though every nerve inside her felt electric. She began, guiding her classmates through the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone who understood the cost of silence. Each point was supported by text, each argument precise. The room listened, because even those who didn't want to hear her couldn't look away. And then it came. "Well, Miss Monroe," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, arms folded and voice dripping with condescension. "Don't you think you're overemphasizing race? Surely there's more to this book than that." A hush fell over the class. Aaliyah's hands stilled at her sides, her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. "Obviously, I believe," she answered evenly, "that the racial themes are central. Ignoring them would be ignoring the soul of the story." Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. "Perhaps in your previous school that kind of narrow reading was encouraged, but here we expect a higher level of interpretation." Aaliyah didn't move, but her silence wasn't retreat. It was resistance. What would you do if someone in power tried to erase your truth in front of a crowd? The students watched with wide eyes, some embarrassed, some quietly thrilled by the spectacle. A few, like Sarah, sat stunned, finally beginning to grasp the weight of what they had witnessed these past weeks. Aaliyah's voice came again, softer but stronger than before. "Respectfully, Mrs. Whitmore, I don't believe standing up for truth is a lack of rigor. I believe it's the very heart of it." In that moment, something shifted, not just in the air, but in her. She was no longer just enduring. She was answering. Sometimes, the most powerful rebellion is telling the truth out loud. The final bell rang, but room 202 wasn't finished. As students gathered their things, Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the noise like a gavel striking wood. "Ms. Monroe," she said with a tight smile, "stay after class. I've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding your recent performance." Aaliyah paused. Her heart beat faster, but she nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am." As the room emptied, a hush fell. Whispers drifted through the halls outside. The classroom door remained slightly ajar. Then footsteps, firm, deliberate, growing louder. Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward the sound, still wearing the same smug expression she'd worn all day. "That must be your parent," she said, almost gleefully. "Let's hope they're not too sensitive." She couldn't have prepared for what came next. The door opened, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. His gaze swept the room calmly, but when it landed on Aaliyah, something flickered. Recognition. Protection. It was Principal David Monroe. Mrs. Whitmore froze. Then she laughed, a hollow, dismissive sound. "Oh, how funny. I didn't realize you were here to observe your own daughter's behavior." "No," Mr. Monroe replied, his tone steady, eyes never leaving hers. "I'm here to observe yours." The silence was deafening. What does it feel like to realize you've exposed your worst self to the one person with the power to hold you accountable? Aaliyah sat straighter, her hands still on her desk, no longer tense but grounded. The power in the room had shifted, and this time it wasn't on Mrs. Whitmore's side. Mr. Monroe turned to his daughter and gave the smallest nod. No words, just presence. And in that presence, a fortress. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It arrives wearing a suit and speaks in measured tones that leave no room for excuses. The door to the conference room clicked shut with a finality that echoed. Mrs. Whitmore straightened her blouse and offered a well-practiced smile. "Mr. Monroe, I'm glad we could meet. I've been concerned about your daughter's attitude and academic alignment. She tends to insert political views where they don't belong." Principal Monroe remained standing. "Go on," he said. Encouraged, Mrs. Whitmore pressed forward, her voice tightening. "She's disruptive, constantly challenges authority. Her interpretation of To Kill a Mockingbird focused almost entirely on race, ignoring the broader literary elements. That's simply not what we teach here." Mr. Monroe's brow twitched, barely, but his voice was calm. "So, discussing race in a novel built around a racially charged trial is what you call disruption?" Mrs. Whitmore blinked. "Well, I believe we should guide students toward universal lessons, not make everything about identity." "Interesting," Mr. Monroe replied. "And what about the moments you refused to acknowledge her hand, or mocked her speech, or accused her of lying over invisible gum?" Her breath caught. For the first time, her composure cracked. "Have you ever watched someone realize they've been heard when they thought they never would?" He stepped closer. "I've listened to your words, your tone, your pattern, and I've seen this before, not in policies, but in people who hide behind them." Mrs. Whitmore swallowed hard, her voice suddenly smaller. I didn't mean any harm." "But you did cause it," he replied, repeatedly. There was no yelling, no theatrics, just truth laid bare. Sometimes the most devastating confrontations don't require raised voices. They require unflinching clarity. As Mr. Monroe reached for the door handle, he paused. "I'll be sitting in on your class tomorrow," he said quietly. "And from now on, we'll be watching how you teach." The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was reckoning. The next morning, room 202 felt different. The usual murmur of students was replaced by an uneasy hush. Books opened quieter, Chairs scraped slower. Everyone was waiting for something. At exactly 9 o'clock a.m., Principal Monroe stepped into the room. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence alone rearranged the atmosphere like wind through tall grass. Aaliyah sat in her usual seat, composed but watchful. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the front, her face pale, her hands clasped tighter than usual. "Good morning, class," she said, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges. "Today, we'll revisit our discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird." But this time, her voice lacked its usual sting. Her gaze flitted nervously toward Mr. Monroe, who stood silently in the back, arms crossed. The lesson limped forward, awkward, hollow, mechanical. Then, the moment arrived. "Not a minute before flight for Panda," Celine said. "Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts again." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Aaliyah raised her head, eyes steady. "Certainly," she replied. She spoke not for revenge, but for truth. Her voice flowed like water breaking a dam. She quoted Harper Lee. She examined moral courage. She named injustice where it lived. And this time, no one cut her off. No one rolled their eyes. Even the ones who once snickered listened. And when she finished, there was no applause. Just silence. The heavy kind that comes from realization. Have you ever felt the entire room shift, not because someone raised their voice, but because they spoke with undeniable clarity? Mr. Monroe stepped forward. He addressed the class, not as an administrator, but as a witness. "What we allow in silence," he said, "we endorse. Remember that." Mrs. Whitmore said nothing. Some lessons aren't written on whiteboards. They're carved into the space between who we were and who we choose to become. By Friday, something had shifted, not just in room 202, but across the entire school. The whispers in the hallways were no longer hushed with fear. They carried new tones: curiosity, respect, even admiration. Students who had once glanced past Aaliyah in the lunch line now paused to say hello. Sarah, from the front row, even sat beside her unprompted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for not saying something sooner." Aaliyah simply nodded. "You're saying it now." But the real change wasn't just social, it was structural. Mr. Monroe called an all-staff meeting that weekend. New policies were drafted. Diversity and equity training became mandatory. A student-led committee was formed to elevate unheard voices. And in a rare show of unity, both students and teachers began showing up, ready to listen, ready to unlearn. Men were addressed, leaving Mr. Whitmore, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave. Her absence left the room quieter, lighter, as if the walls had exhaled. On Monday, a new substitute greeted the class, but all eyes were on Aaliyah. She took her seat as always, calm, unshaken, but something in her posture had changed. Not defiance, ownership. Have you ever watched a person reclaim their place not because it was given, but because they never should have had to fight for it in the first place? Later that afternoon, as she walked to the parking lot beside her father, they paused at the empty space where Mrs. Whitmore's car once sat. Mr. Monroe placed a hand gently on Aaliyah's shoulder. "You know," he said, "what you did wasn't just brave, it was necessary." Aaliyah looked ahead. "I just hope it makes a difference." He smiled. "It already has." Some stories don't end with applause. They end with quiet victories, the kind that ripple through time, shaping tomorrow. Sometimes dignity speaks loudest in silence. In a world that often rewards volume and power, we can forget the quiet strength it takes to stay composed under pressure. Aaliyah Monroe didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She stood her ground, not with anger, but with calm clarity. And in doing so, she reminded us that resilience doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looks like taking notes while others dismiss you. Sometimes it's finishing your sentence even when no one wants to hear it. The story isn't just about a student and a teacher. It's about how easily we overlook people when they don't match our expectations, and what we learn when they prove us wrong. We all carry memories of being unheard, or perhaps of failing to hear others. But it's never too late to choose differently, to pause, to listen, to see someone not for who we assume they are, but for who they truly are. After all, the most powerful change doesn't always come from loud moments. It comes from honest ones. What quiet truths are waiting for you to notice today? Aaliyah didn't need applause to know she had changed something. Her strength was loud. It was steady, like roots holding ground beneath a storm. In the silence that followed her stand, healing quietly began. Not just for her, but for others who had learned to stay quiet, who now saw that silence didn't have to mean surrender. The classroom, once a space of quiet dismissal, became a place of difficult but necessary reflection. New conversations started, new leaders emerged, and the echoes of what happened that week stretched far beyond the final bell. Because when injustice is confronted with calm truth, it doesn't disappear, it's exposed. And once exposed, it can no longer be ignored. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.